If you've ever made a mistake so small it seemed harmless, only to watch it spiral into consequences you never saw coming, stay with me until the end of this. 1. Because what happens on this rain-soaked street will remind you that the universe has a gay, strange sense of timing. And if stories like this keep you hooked, do me a favor, hit like and subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. Daniel Cole had spent 11 years climbing the corporate ladder at Halbrook Financial Group, a mid-sized firm that specialized in brokering high-stakes mergers between mid-tier companies and larger, ambition-hungry conglomerates. He wasn't a genius. He wasn't especially charismatic. What Daniel had, instead, was relentless persistence. The kind that came from a man who had rebuilt his entire life from the ground up after the most painful chapter of it had ended 3 years earlier, when his marriage to Victoria fell apart. The divorce hadn't been dramatic in the way people expect. There were no screaming matches, no public scenes, no dramatic betrayals splashed across anyone's imagination. It had simply been the slow, quiet erosion of two people who had married too young, built careers that pulled them in opposite directions, and eventually realized that the version of each other they'd fallen in love with no longer existed. Victoria had wanted more than Daniel's junior analyst salary could offer at the time, not out of greed, but out of a deep, aching desire to build something significant with her life, something Daniel's cautious, risk-averse nature could never quite match. Daniel, for his part, had buried the hurt of the divorce under an obsessive dedication to his career, telling himself that if he couldn't keep his marriage together, he would at least prove to himself, and quietly, to her, that he could build something impressive on his own. For 3 years, Daniel poured every ounce of himself into climbing Halbrook's ranks, finally landing the opportunity of a lifetime, leading the firm's side of negotiations on a merger deal worth just over $10 billion, connecting Halbrook's largest client with the private equity arm of one of the most powerful men in the country, a notoriously private billionaire named Marcus Hale. Daniel had worked the deal for 8 grueling months, flying across 3 continents, surviving brutal all-night negotiation sessions, and finally arriving at the last, most critical meeting, the final signing, scheduled for 6 o'clock on a rain-soaked Thursday evening at Hale Tower, the gleaming glass skyscraper that anchored the city's financial district. What Daniel didn't know, what none of his colleagues at Halbrook had thought to mention, because frankly, none of them had ever met Victoria or connected her name to his messy divorce, 3 years earlier, was that Marcus Hale's wife, the woman standing quietly beside him at every major public event for the past 18 months, was none other than Daniel's ex-wife, Victoria. After the divorce, Victoria had thrown herself into rebuilding her own career with the same ferocious determination Daniel eventually found in his. She'd moved to a different division of the finance world entirely, working her way into elite social and business circles that Daniel's mid-tier firm never touched. She met Marcus Hale at a charity gala 18 months after her divorce was finalized, and what began as a professional connection slowly blossomed into a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared ambition. They married quietly, avoiding the tabloid spectacle Marcus usually attracted, and Victoria settled into her new life with the same quiet composure she brought to everything she did. She rarely discussed her first marriage, not out of shame, but simply because that chapter of her life felt entirely disconnected from the person she'd called. Not on the evening of the merger signing, torrential rain had turned the financial district into a maze of reflective puddles and honking traffic. Daniel, running 15 minutes behind schedule after his rideshare got stuck in gridlock 2 blocks from Hale Tower, abandoned the car and ran the rest of the way on foot, documents clutched against his chest, rain soaking through his suit jacket, his mind entirely consumed by the mounting anxiety of arriving late to the single most important meeting of his career. Victoria, meanwhile, had arrived at Hale Tower moments earlier for an entirely unrelated reason, a board dinner scheduled for later that evening, coincidentally in the very same building where Daniel's merger was about to close. She stepped out of her car, elegant in a cream trench coat, and began walking calmly toward the entrance, entirely unaware that her ex-husband was sprinting toward the very same doors from the opposite direction. It happened in an instant. A delivery truck sped through a deep puddle at the curb just as Daniel, head down, sprinting and checking his watch, plowed through the same stretch of flooded sidewalk. The combined force of the truck's spray and Daniel's tour's own momentum sent a thick wave of muddy rainwater directly across Victoria's cream coat, splattering up her sleeve and across the side of her face before she even registered what was happening. "Are you kidding me?" Victoria snapped, stopping short, wiping muddy water from her cheek with visible, uncharacteristic fury cutting through her usual composure. "I'm so sorry, I didn't even see," Daniel began, turning to apologize on reflex. the words dying in his throat, the instant his eyes met hers. For a long, frozen moment, neither of them said anything at all. Rain continued to fall between them, streaking down faces suddenly locked in stunned recognition. 3 years. 3 years since Daniel had last seen this face, the face he's once fallen asleep next to for nearly a decade, the face he'd told himself he'd made peace with never seeing again. Daniel? Victoria finally said, disbelief cutting through her irritation. Victoria, he managed, his voice barely above the sound of the rain. What are you? I had no idea you'd be. Neither did I, she said sharply, glancing down at her ruined coat, then back up at him with an expression that mixed exasperation, shock, and something else Daniel couldn't quite place. Their reunion, chaotic and soaked as it was, might have ended there. An awkward, uncomfortable coincidence quickly forgotten in the rush of two people moving on with separate lives. Except for one detail that Daniel was about to discover in the worst possible way. As Victoria straightened, composing herself with visible effort, a black town car pulled up to the curb behind her, and a tall, silver-haired man stepped out beneath an umbrella held by a waiting assistant. Victoria, is everything all right? The man asked, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone used to rooms falling silent. When he entered them, Daniel's stomach dropped as recognition hit him like a second wave of cold water. He knew that face. He'd studied that face in briefing documents for 8 straight months. Marcus Hale, the billionaire behind the very deal Daniel was racing, at this exact moment, 15 minutes late, to close. Marcus, this is... Victoria hesitated, glancing at Daniel with an unreadable expression. This is Daniel, my ex-husband. The silence that followed felt, to Daniel, louder than the rain itself. Marcus's expression shifted from concern to careful curiosity as he studied Daniel more closely. Daniel. Cole? He asked slowly. You're the Halbrook representative I'm meeting in 20 minutes. Daniel felt the floor of his entire career tilt beneath him. Yes, sir, he managed. I am so sorry about what just happened. It was a complete accident. I didn't see the puddle. I was running late and You splashed my wife, Marcus said flatly, his tone unreadable. With mud, moments before walking into the biggest negotiation of your career. There was nothing Daniel could say that wouldn't sound worse than silence. He stood there, drenched, humiliated, watching 8 months of exhausting work threaten to collapse over an accident he hadn't An accident involving, of all people, the one woman in the world whose opinion of him had once mattered more than anyone else's. What happened next surprised everyone standing on that rain-soaked sidewalk, including Victoria herself. It was an accident, Marcus, Victoria said quietly, her earlier irritation fading into something more measured. He didn't even see me. The truck did most of it, honestly. She looked at Daniel directly for the first time since the initial shock had worn off. Go inside and change. You clearly need to be presentable for this meeting, and dripping wet in the lobby isn't going to help your case. Marcus studied his wife for a long moment, then glanced at Daniel with an expression that had shifted from irritation into something closer to reluctant curiosity. You have exactly 15 minutes before I walk into that boardroom, he said. Use them wisely. What followed was one of the strangest 15 minutes of Daniel's professional life. Victoria, rather than walking away to salvage her ruined coat and forget the entire encounter, walked with him into the building, guiding him toward a restroom where he could at least attempt to dry off, all while the two of them exchanged the kind of rapid, disbelieving small talk that only comes from two people whose entire shared history had just collided in the worst possible circumstances. I can't believe this is happening, Daniel muttered, wringing water out of his sleeve in the restroom mirror's reflection while Victoria waited just outside the door. Neither can I, Victoria admitted through the door. Married to a man who apparently controls half your firm's biggest deal, and my ex-husband shows up covered in mud trying to negotiate with him. Despite everything, despite the mud, despite the humiliation, despite 3 years of unresolved history suddenly standing far too close together, Daniel felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't expected. The strange, unfamiliar relief of simply being seen by someone who had once known him completely, without any of the professional armor he'd built up in the years since. For what it's worth, Daniel said, stepping out of the restroom, considerably drier but still visibly rattled. You look happy, Victoria. Genuinely happy. I'm glad. Victoria studied him for a long moment, something in her expression softened, the last of her earlier anger fully dissolving. You look tired, she said honestly, but you look like you're finally proud of something you built yourself. That matters more than you probably realize. Their brief walk back toward the boardroom was quiet, charged with everything unsaid between two people who had once shared a life and now shared, improbably, a single tense afternoon. At the boardroom doors, Victoria paused. For what it's worth, she said, Marcus respects people who handle pressure well. Don't let the mud rattle you more than the deal itself. Daniel walked into that boardroom soaked around the edges but standing taller than he had in some months. The negotiation that followed was, by every account later shared among Halbrook's senior partners, the toughest and most impressive performance of Daniel's career. Marcus Hale, initially cool and reserved given the chaotic circumstances of their first meeting, gradually warmed as Daniel presented his case with a clarity and composure that belied the disaster of 10 minutes earlier. By the time the final documents were signed, just before 8 o'clock that evening, the $10 billion merger was officially complete, a defining achievement that would reshape the trajectory of Daniel's entire career. As Daniel left Hale Tower that night, exhausted but triumphant, he found Victoria waiting near the entrance, Marcus a respectful distance away speaking with an aide. "Congratulations," Victoria said simply. "I heard it went well." "It did," Daniel admitted. "Thanks to you, honestly. If you'd walked away angry, I don't think Marcus would have given me the benefit of the doubt." Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile Daniel had seen from her since the accident. "We had our chapter, Daniel," she said. "It didn't end the way either of us wanted, but it doesn't mean I wanted to see you fail either. I'm glad you built something you're proud of." "Same to you," Daniel said quietly, glancing briefly toward Marcus. "You deserve this happiness, Victoria. I mean that." They parted ways that evening as something neither of them had expected to become again. Not reconciled lovers, not bitter exes locked in resentment, but two people who had genuinely, finally, made peace with a chapter of their lives that had once felt like nothing but failure. Daniel returned to Halbrook the following week, not just as the man who closed the firm's largest deal in history, but as someone who had finally let go of the quiet, unspoken guilt he'd carried since his divorce. The belief that somehow, failing at marriage meant failing as a person entirely. In the months that followed, Daniel's career flourished beyond anything he'd imagined, but more importantly, he found himself finally present in his own life, rather than constantly, proving something to a version of himself still haunted by old failures. He started dating again, cautiously, then genuinely, eventually building a relationship built on mutual respect rather than desperate ambition. Victoria, for her part, occasionally sent a brief, friendly message whenever Halbrook's name appeared in financial news, a small, quiet gesture of goodwill between two people who had found unlikely closure in the most chaotic 15 minutes either of them could have imagined. Looking back, Daniel would often tell the story of that rain-soaked evening, not as the humiliating disaster it first appeared to be, but as the strange, unexpected turning point that finally allowed him to stop running from his past and start walking, fully present, into whatever came next. Sometimes, he'd say, the universe doesn't warn you before it hands you exactly the collision you need. Sometimes it just lets the rain fall, lets the mud fly, and waits to see who you become once you're forced to face what you've been avoiding all along.